sometimes when you're close to historical moments, you miss them. There's a tendency to miss history if you're living it at the moment. And I think we're at a point where, which you might call a strategic inflection point or a pivotal moment, a moment like I've seen only several times in the last decades, right? The Germans even have coined a phrase for this. It's a Zeitenwende, right? Now, what do I mean by pivotal moment? Well, I think there have been three in my professional lifetime, right? And if you bear with me, I'll run through these because I think we're at the third one today. And the three pivotal moments are 11/9, 9/11, and 2/24. So let me unpack that a bit. So I believe that the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989, led to a series of strategic events, the implications of which we're still living with today, right? Maybe very prominently living with, given the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 91, and the fact that Vladimir Putin has personal experience with that strategic inflection point. But for decades after November 9th and the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've been living with adjustments, ripple effects, implications from that pivotal moment. The second one in my lifetime, and I think for all of us on the screen, is certainly for Americans, is 9/11, right? And for the last 20 years at least, we've been living with the implications of those attacks on Washington and New York on September 11th, 2001. And then I list as my third pivotal moment, February 24th of this year. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I say that I think it's a pivotal moment because I believe that in the decades ahead, we will be living with the repercussions, the shockwaves emanating from February 24th of this year. We've begun to see the effects, obviously, and the epicenter of the attacks on February 24th obviously are playing out in Ukraine itself, right? So you have significant casualties on both sides, tragically significant casualties among Ukrainian citizens. You've got Ukrainian citizens who have sought refugee status. 5 to 7 million is the estimate. You've got at least that number displaced internally inside Ukraine. You've got a devastated Ukrainian economy. Something like 45% decrease in GDP is the estimate for this year of the Ukrainian economy. You've got significant military losses on both sides. And so you've really got the center of the activity. The shock began inside Ukraine itself. But to demonstrate my point, there are ripple effects or repercussions emanating from that epicenter that we're only now beginning to feel. The most prominent impacts are in Europe itself, with the refugee flow, with the attempt by our European allies to re-engineer the energy marketplace and reduce or actually eventually eliminate their reliance on Russian oil and gas, and the sparking of inflation that process has generated. We've seen the disruption of grain, food supplies coming out of the region. We've seen ripple effects there that go well beyond Europe itself into the global south, especially Africa and the Middle East, who are reliant on that grain. And then you've got some subtle effects that haven't played out completely yet, but I think will continue to play out in the months ahead. So for example, not only was it the Ukrainian grain supply that was disrupted, but Ukrainian fertilizer, which will have a downstream effect on food productivity, especially in Africa. You see that as we try to re-engineer global energy marketplaces, that will have an effect across the world because this is a very tight market, both in terms of oil and gas. You see the inflationary effects of those moves today being felt by every household in Europe. You can see some of those inflationary impacts all the way across the Atlantic into the United States. The big geostrategic impact that hasn't yet played out is what will be the effect on China, and in particular, Chinese President Xi's decision-making process as he observes what's happening to his erstwhile ally, or at least partner, Vladimir Putin. I'm hopeful here. I think there's a reasonable chance that Xi will draw two quick conclusions, maybe not quick, but hopeful conclusions from what he's observing in Ukraine. First of all, I'm hopeful that President Xi looks at the PLA, his army, and with a bit of healthy skepticism about the vast quantities of investment that China has made in its military. And maybe he'll wonder, well, wait a second, Putin made investments like that in his military, and it hasn't proven out effectively on the ground. So maybe there's a deterrent effect about exactly what is the military promise of the Chinese military. And then the second, I think, for President Xi, and this is a repercussion that hasn't been felt yet, is perhaps a deterrent effect with regard to the economics and the economic effects that the invasion of Ukraine has had on Russia, and a concern that China could not persist, could not tolerate. And it's worthwhile to note that Chinese trade has two premier partners globally, $2.5 trillion a year with Europe and $1.5 trillion a year with the United States. So I'm hopeful that both in terms of the promise of the PLA and Xi's military, but also the potential devastating effects of economic sanctions, which are in place against Russia, and which Xi might be concerned could be generated against him, are cautionary signs for Chinese President Xi. This takes you back to the early days, 1949. Harry Truman is the president, and NATO was crafted, original 12 alliance members at the time. And the basic raison d'etre, the basic reason that we formed NATO was that we looked back over the previous 50 years of European history, and America essentially said, we're not doing that again. After the experience of World War I and World War II, we said to ourselves, we are not again going to be so unprepared for a major security challenge in Europe that requires American intervention on the scale that World War I and World War II did. So we crafted NATO, right? And I think that the now 73-year history of NATO comes in sort of three bits. So for the first 40 years, roughly from 49 to 89, my first inflection point, you had the Cold War years. And here NATO was completely absorbed, completely focused on the bilateral competition with then the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and so forth. This is where Mark Hertling and I suspect others on the call today, served our early years, right? I mean, Mark and I went to Europe as young lieutenants, and I think probably together we have a couple of decades of service in US Army Europe, which Mark commanded as a 3-star. So those first 40 years might be labeled NATO 1.0, right? Or the first phase of NATO. I think after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then 2 years later, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, after my first inflection point, right? NATO entered about 20 years of another experience. And this is the sort of post-Cold War period where NATO didn't have a standoff competition, a bilateral competition with a peer, the Soviet Union, which had dissolved, right? And NATO took on new members. We went from the original 12 members to now 30 members. So a vast number of new allies. And where did these allies come from? They came from the former Warsaw Pact members. And in the case of the 3 Baltic states, they actually came from 3 of the 15 SSRs, Soviet Socialist Republics, right? So given a chance in this phase 2 of NATO's history, given a chance of countries that had lived alongside or under the thumb of the Soviet Union, and given the freedom to make a choice, they all walked west. They all voted with their feet and joined the alliance. And then I think after roughly 2014, I think NATO moved into what might be considered NATO 3.0, or the third phase. And I labeled it 2014 because, you know, it's sometimes today easy to forget that 8 years ago in 2014, Russia first invaded Ukraine and first annexed illegally Ukrainian territory, sovereign territory, the Crimean Peninsula, and then sections of the so-called Donbass, the two Ukrainian provinces right up against the Russian border. And that was the first in 2014. That was the first seizure of land, the first violation of territorial integrity, the first violation of the UN Charter, which recognizes territorial integrity and national sovereignty, right, by Vladimir Putin's Russia. And really today, with now the wholesale invasion by Russia of Ukraine, you see a continuation from what began in 2014. So I think NATO today is in NATO 3.0, or the third strategic phase of the now 73-year history of the alliance. And how NATO adapts to this in this third phase is not yet decided. I mean, we know some early responses, right? NATO defense spending has increased largely across the board since 2014. We know that NATO has postured its forces, its national forces, eastward after 2014 in countries, in allied states, which never had NATO troops positioned there before. The three Baltic states and Poland after 2014, and now after 2024, additional states on essentially NATO's eastern flank. So NATO has taken force posture decisions. NATO has taken spending decisions, or nations have taken spending decisions. And they've also taken readiness decisions. So there've been a series of moves to increase the force readiness of NATO's backup forces. So while some forces are positioned forward along the eastern flank, backing them up in the depth of the alliance are significant combat forces on a higher state of readiness than before. So NATO's taking some adjustments. I think the party most responsible for these NATO adaptations, so whether it's defense spending, force readiness, or force posture, force positioning along NATO's eastern flank, the one president we should look to as most responsible is Vladimir Putin. The political weight of the alliance has definitely shifted eastward. So here, the voices of the Baltic states, Poland, Romania are much stronger today than they were in NATO 2.0. So in the post-Cold War period, where these countries were just aspiring to join NATO, right? So I think one of the impacts of the aggression in 2014, and then again this year by Putin against Ukraine, has been that the sort of the center of gravity of the alliance has shifted eastward. And you see this play out very prominently. These are the same countries that lead the alliance in providing military assistance to Ukraine. These are the same countries that are welcoming Ukrainian refugees and so forth. So I think that's a very clear impact. Another impact, of course, is that we're on the verge of moving from 30 NATO allies to 32. As you suggested, with hopefully the soon addition of Sweden and Finland. We can talk a little bit more about the politics of bringing those two into the alliance. But that's a very significant impact in this phase of NATO. I mean, these are two countries that are well-established, mature democracies, very much representing NATO's core values: democracy, individual liberty, rule of law. Very well established politically. And they also bring significant military capability to the alliance. Not only significant national capability to defend themselves, but significant military capability that lends to the collective defense, right? These are capabilities that they could apply elsewhere across the alliance. So this is NATO enlargement that we might believe in, right? Because they're both strong democracies and militarily capable. If I were to predict the next phase of NATO, right, I think first of all it would be founded on a sustained commitment not to tolerate the aggression in Ukraine. And by that, I mean, I think NATO will accept its responsibility to continue to support the Ukrainians in their fight for territorial integrity and national sovereignty. So I think that's a sort of a foundational point. I think over time, however, we could expect some additional adaptations in NATO. First of all, with regard to what military capabilities the alliance focuses on. You know, the military capabilities today in NATO are essentially three tiers. There's a nuclear tier, so the alliance is a nuclear capable alliance, alongside the three member states that are national nuclear powers, the US, the UK, and France. NATO has a nuclear capability. Below that is the conventional tier. So this is everything Boeing makes, Allison. So these are, tanks, aircraft, ships, and so forth. So what sorts of things are below conventional attack? These are the sorts of challenges that include cyber attacks, disinformation, misinformation campaigns, interference in our domestic democratic processes, energy intimidation, and so forth. As the Russian capability in the conventional realm suffers heavy attrition and will need to be rebuilt over 10 or 15 years after Ukraine, as the conventional capability decreases, I think Russia will revert to this sub-conventional realm much more than it did in the past. And then the other arena where I think NATO 4.0, if we might, right? That we might imagine NATO playing a bigger role is in European collective concern about Chinese influence on the European mainland. Now, I don't mean by this that NATO is going to expand its boundaries and begin to patrol the South China Sea, or that NATO's going to send naval task forces into the Pacific. I don't mean militarily challenge or militarily compete with China. I mean mostly competition in this sub-conventional realm, so information campaigns, political intimidation, and so forth, but also mean in the economic realm. If you plot today Chinese investment in critical infrastructure on the European mainland, you find some very interesting things. You just find that the Chinese now own the Greek deep sea port at Piraeus in Greece. You see concerted Chinese investment in transportation infrastructure, mass communications infrastructure. Remember the whole drama about Huawei producing mass communications or delivering mass communications in Europe. And these critical infrastructures are important to NATO because in every instance, they are dual purpose infrastructure. So a Greek seaport today may be mostly commercial, but of course it provides a naval capacity as well. Railroads, highways, and so forth are dual purpose. And of course, mass communications is used just as much by our military chain of command as it is by the civilians. So one thing that I think that NATO has got to do as it looks forward is accept that China has an investment program in Europe, and that it may have security implications. And alongside NATO's best partner, the European Union, together they have to figure out what to do with that kind of concerted Chinese influence on the mainland. With commercial influence, China expects a political payoff down the road. So both the sort of retooling against the Russian challenge, with a special attention on the sub-conventional challenges, but also an awakening, an increased awareness of what China's doing in Europe, I think are key parts of what NATO is going to have to contend with going forward. Article 5, as you referred to it, of course, is the fifth article in the NATO treaty. It's about 4 sentences long, right? And it essentially says an attack on one shall be considered an attack on all. And it's very interesting, in the 73-year history of the alliance, Article 5 has only been invoked once by NATO. And it literally happened on the day after 9/11, September 12th, when in unison, our then 27 allies stood in a council meeting and reported to Nick Burns, who was my predecessor, the US ambassador at that time, that they stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States in response to the Al-Qaeda attacks on the US. And the result of that, by the way, is that in the 20 years following 9/11, leading all the way up to last year and our final evacuation of Afghanistan, we had NATO allies serving side by side, shoulder to shoulder with us for 20 years in Afghanistan. And that all emanates from the invocation of Article 5. Now, NATO, the challenge with the NATO treaty is that it has stood the test of time for 73 years, right? And it doesn't get amended. I mean, it's never been amended. Any amendment of the Washington Treaty would essentially require all current members to agree. So it could only be amended by consensus, right? And in effect, it's only amended when we add a new member, right? So which literally requires a new protocol to the treaty and agreement with all current members. So it's unlikely that Article 5 is going to be rewritten. But NATO has taken some policy decisions, which in effect help explain that it may not be an armed attack that NATO has to respond to, but it may be aggression in this subconventional strata, like a cyber attack that causes Article 5 to be invoked. So in 2014, NATO actually took a policy decision that a cyber attack may trigger Article 5. The national security strategy, the US national security strategy, was just issued maybe a month ago. A couple of weeks later, the national defense strategy, sort of the Pentagon's counterpart to the national security strategy, has now been issued. And both documents are quite clear and quite consistent here, that the major strategic competitor that faces the United States over the rest of our lifetime, right, the next 20 years or so, right, will be China. And this is because of just the geography, the demographics, the economy, the potential of China as a global player. And I think that's undeniable. In fact, if anything, the second near peer competitor mentioned in these strategy documents, Russia, is on the decline. So you've got two competitors facing the United States, one ascendant, China, although it's ascendant, but not as I'm demonstrating here, not on a straight line of progress. It will have bumps in the road, and it's got some strategic challenges itself. But you've got the second, Putin's Russia, which is descendant and on the decline. And in both cases, these strategy documents argue that we have to manage these moves, right? We have to manage the growth of strategic power by China. And quite candidly, especially given the evidence that Russia's military power is not what we assessed it to be, we have to manage the decline of Putin's Russia. I mean, at the end of the day, this takes us off the question of China. But the primary concern I have about the war in Ukraine right now is the potential implosion and disintegration of the Russian Federation. My major concern is that, if Russia grows so weak and disintegrates on the periphery or among these ethnic groups, is that disintegration involves 7,000 nuclear weapons. And we narrowly averted strategic disaster in 1991 and the years that followed, the breakup of the Soviet Union, when we were able successfully, and a huge, I think, underappreciated strategic success story was our ability to secure the nuclear weapons spread across the Soviet space and secure all those nuclear weapons in the hands of the Russians themselves, right? So I worry about a repeat, the sort of disaggregation of the Russian Federation and what happens to those 7,000 nuclear weapons. I'm watching with interest two ongoing case studies of where economically we are essentially trying to reverse course from the globalized economy that took place over the last 20 or 30 years, right? In the post-Cold War period. The first is the ongoing attempt to to isolate Russia, and in particular to deny Russia's export of its energy, right, oil and gas. So here we created 20 or 25 years of connections between Russia and the global energy market, and now we're trying to unravel those connections. And then the second case in point that we're witnessing is the US attempt to deny microchips to China, right? So recent moves, quite prominent moves by the Biden administration, has us essentially trying to say we will not allow China access to the next sort of tier, the next generation of most capable microchips. And in both cases, these fly in the face of the economic connections and interconnections that characterized the last 20 years. So it's going to be interesting to see if we can do this. Can we actually unravel these economic connections that have been made over the last 20 years? And what are the impacts, the unintended, unexpected impacts on us of trying to do just that? I think the way to think about this is political and economic competition first, backed up by a military dimension. On Ukraine, look, yes, I think Ukraine can sustain and will sustain the fight against Russia. The Russian conventional military capability has suffered very substantial attrition. And you know, I go back to my early days alongside Mark as a lieutenant. We entered the US Army at a point where the Army was at a historical low in terms of morale and readiness and so forth. And this is, of course, coming out of the long Vietnam experience. It took the US Army 15 years to go from the helicopters off the roof of the embassy in Saigon to Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And that was 15 years of a national effort to transform our military. We went to the all-volunteer force. We introduced new significant weapon systems. We completely renovated our training regimen and so forth, right? I don't think Putin can generate that kind of transformation in his forces. It's not a reflection of Russian society. So my bet here is on the Ukrainians, who have not only mobilized their military, but mobilized their entire population behind the leadership of Zelensky. The question I have for Ukraine is that whenever the fighting stops and wherever the lines are finally drawn, whether it's all the way back, all of Ukrainian territory, or it's back to the pre-224 boundaries, right? Can Ukraine adapt politically and economically to rebuild itself? We should recall that before 224, before the Russian invasion, Ukraine was perhaps the most rated as among the most corrupt countries in Europe. So how does Zelensky or Zelensky's successor move from being the wartime president to being the reconstruction president? And what impact does this influx of probably hundreds of billions of investment dollars into post-conflict Ukraine, how does it intersect with Ukraine's structural flaws and institutional weaknesses that really reflect this kind of culture of corruption? That's the strategic question for Ukraine.
I want to thank you, Ambassador, for your time with us. I want to thank Boeing for making all this possible.